A man was reported missing in Spokane, Washington. The 4 perpetrators would be caught and sentenced, but it would take 8 years before his remains would be identified. In 2018 and 2020, human remains would be found, but it would take 2 years for DNA testing to confirm a match between the remains and another year for the remains to be linked to a missing person. 32-year-old Bret Robert Snow was first reported missing in 2015 in Spokane, Washington. The detectives believed that Bret had been the victim of a slaying. They found that the last active ping of his cell phone was near a home off Star Road in Newman Lake that had been searched that summer for evidence of illegal substance dealing. Despite no body being found, they charged 4 people in connection to Bret's slaying. 3 of them, Alvar Guajardo, Cheryl Sutton, and Colby Vodder, were tried and found guilty by juries. Evidence and witness testimony indicated that Bret had been beaten to his end and dismembered, after which they disposed of his remains in different areas. Witnesses said that the slaying occurred after Bret had either made a bad substance deal or lost substances belonging to Vodder. After they were arrested, a witness, Russell Joyce, came forward and said that Bret had been kidnapped and beaten for several days at the home, and that they had ended Bret's life when it became clear that he would pass away from his injuries. Russell was the first witness in Guajardo's trial. He was one of the last people to see Bret alive and claimed that Guajardo took him away after the others had tied him up with a phone cord. Russell also said that in the following days, he heard what sounded like power tools being used in the property's shop. After knocking on the door, Guajardo told him that they had just poached a deer. He said that he was later threatened by Guajardo, which contributed to why he did not initially go to the police. Russell was given a deal, granting him immunity for his cooperation. A forensic search of the garage at the home on Star Road, which was sold to new owners in 2016, revealed Bret's DNA. Guajardo was sentenced to a 47-year prison sentence at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. Vodder was sentenced to 29 years in jail at Washington Correction Center in Shelton. Sutton was sentenced to 31 years in prison, but is in the middle of serving her federal illegal substance sentence at a facility in Waseca, Minnesota. In March 2021, a 4th man charged, Kenneth Stone, took a plea deal. At his sentencing hearing, he became emotional and said to Bret's mother, Lori, "If I knew, I would tell you where Bret is." He was sentenced to 22 years. Bret's mother, sister, and other family members were in court every day. You could see tears as soon as they heard the words guilty. While the Snow family said that they were grateful for justice, they longed to find his remains to give him a proper burial. Lori said, "Just give us a part of Bret. Just a little bit so we can give him a proper rest. It would be so much easier just knowing. I can only hope somebody would come forward and just tell us." By 2023, Lori admitted that hope for finding him was rapidly fading. Then, one day, seemingly out of nowhere, Lori's phone rang. She said, "When I got that phone call, it was quite the shock. It was a phone call I did not think I would get. It was the detective who worked the case tirelessly that said that DNA confirmed that remains found in the Spokane River were in fact those of her son." In September 2018, a man fly fishing in the Spokane River found a small skull fragment, but DNA analysis could not be completed at the time due to a lack of resources. In August 2020, another skull fragment was found in a different area of the river. Miraculously, despite their small size, both individuals who found the fragments called the discovery in, giving Spokane County Medical Examiner Dr. Veena Singh's office a chance at an identification. Dr. Singh said, "There are a lot of observant people in the area." Initially, no one suspected that the 2 discoveries were connected. They were stored as unidentified remains, just 1 or 2 of more than 20 cases. In 2022, resources became available to examine the skull fragments. Using American Rescue Plan Act funds, the Spokane County Medical Examiner's Office sent both fragments to Othram. Othram confirmed that the fragments belonged to the same person and law enforcement uploaded the DNA profile to various genealogy databases, identifying dozens of relatives and confirming that the remains belonged to Bret. Lori said, "It is a confirmation he is there. They did find a part of him, so that is a good thing. It does not completely bring closure, but it is something. It is something which may never have happened without the tenacity of Dr. Singh and her team of investigators." She said, "It is so meaningful. That is what we are here for, right? The families, the service to the family and to the community. Whenever we have someone come in as an unknown, we take that as an obligation to find out who they are, to give them back their name." She added, "Everybody matters. Everyone deserves to have a name. Families deserve to know what happened to their person. And they deserve to lay them to rest, something Lori is finally able to work towards for Bret with the help of the ME." Lori said of SCSO, prosecutors, and anyone else who worked her son's case, "I just really appreciate everything they have done for my family." Four bodies would be discovered in October 1983 in Indiana. Two were identified immediately, and the serial perpetrator, known as the highway perpetrator, admitted guilt. After 4 decades, the remaining 2 bodies would be identified due to new investigative genetic genealogy technologies. On October 18, 1983, the remains of 4 people were discovered on an abandoned farm in Lake Village, Newton County in rural Indiana. It was unclear how the 4 victims' lives were taken. All 4 victims had been bound and stabbed more than 24 times, and the trousers and underwear of each victim were discovered around their ankles. The body of one victim had also been dismembered. 2 of the victims were identified via dental records within months as Michael Bauer and John Bartlett, but the other 2 victims, called Brad and Adam Doe, remained unidentified until almost 40 years later, when Mr. Scott McCord began working as the Newton County coroner 26 years later, in 2009. He ordered anthropological and dental analyses, facial sketches, and DNA tests to determine the identities of the remains. None of those efforts helped. He said, "I do not know how many times you are ready to give up." 7 years later, in 2016, he decided to hold a pseudo-funeral for the 2 unidentified victims whose remains, he said, have been sitting on a shelf. He said, adding that 19 high school students volunteered to be pallbearers for the 2 victims, and that nearly 100 people showed up for the ceremony. "I know nobody would have the passion that I did to get these kids identified." After the funeral, he said, "Oh God, it was unbelievably emotional. Nobody knew who they were, but the people of our county just kind of took them in as their own." Then, in 2019, Newton County officials reached out to the DNA Doe Project with Brad Doe's case. After sequencing Brad Doe's DNA, they were able to find matches to several close relatives of Brad Doe to identify the remains as belonging to John Ingram Brandenburg Jr. He was a 19-year-old from Chicago, Illinois, who went to a friend's house one day and never made it home. With the success in identifying John, Mr. McCord then took the Adam Doe case to the DNA Doe Project in 2020. The DNA Doe Project said in a statement, "Working with highly degraded DNA, the case spent more than 2 years in the labs where multiple attempts were made to create a workable DNA profile that could be uploaded to the databases used for forensic cases." Mr. McCord said DNA was taken from Adam Doe's bones, which were really degraded. Once they had DNA that they could work with, a team of investigative genetic genealogists began to try to find DNA matches. Mr. McCord said that they reached out to people they thought could be related to Adam Doe, in some cases even knocking on doors. Eventually, they tracked down a man who would later turn out to be a first cousin of him. The man told Mr. McCord that he had a cousin who disappeared in 1983. Mr. McCord said, "Literally everything he started telling us about this young man just fell right into place." The cousin, whom investigators declined to name, led them to one of Adam Doe's brothers, whose DNA confirmed a match. In July 2023, the Newton County Coroner's Office in Indiana said that he had been identified as Keith Lavell Bibbs of Chicago, who was 16 when he disappeared. Mr. McCord said, "I think it was a shock to the family. I have known this young man as Adam just as long as the family knew him as Keith. It is kind of strange." Keith's remains could finally be delivered to his family. All 4 men were victims of Larry Eyler, the serial perpetrator known as the highway perpetrator, who took the lives of at least 21 young men. He preyed across the Midwest, and some of his victims were young gay men whom he stabbed several times. Eyler was arrested in Chicago in October 1983 when he was charged with ending the life of 28-year-old Ralph E. Calise of Chicago, whose body had been found a couple of months before in Lake County, north of the city. Eyler later admitted to several slayings, including the 2 people whose bodies were among the 4 found on the farm, and was identified at the time. The authorities concluded that he had taken all 4 people's lives. In a letter dated December 18, 1990, Eyler wrote that he ended the life of an unidentified black male in his late teens or early 20s in mid-July 1983 by an abandoned farmhouse in Indiana. Keith was black, while the 3 other victims found on the farm were white. According to his confession, Keith was a hitchhiker who agreed to submit to a sexual act for $75, and John was an individual whom Eyler claimed to have been introduced to by his alleged accomplice, Robert David Little, at his Terre Haute residence. He was unaware of either of their actual identities. In addition, he is known to have disposed of any forms of identification that he would find on his victim's possession. Eyler passed away in prison in 1994, while on capital punishment for the 1984 slaying of 15-year-old Danny Bridges of Chicago. It is unclear how Keith and the other victims ended up in Indiana. Mr. McCord said that one of Keith's relatives long believed that he had run away from home. Mr. McCord said the following about telling Keith's family that his remains had been identified. "I know it was a shock when they found out how he lost his life, but it brings some sense of comfort, knowing where he is at, and pretty soon he will be back home where he belongs." In April 1995, Michigan police would receive a 911 call that would lead to an investigation that would only be solved almost 3 decades later. A father of 4's perpetrator would flee the country and only be found after the help of technology, bringing resolution to a family that suffered a terrible heartbreak. On April 24, 1995, around 6:30 a.m., the police got a call from a payphone in Lawton, Michigan. The caller said that a crime took place. She led deputies to the victim's body, which had been dumped in the parking lot of a vineyard on 92nd Avenue on 36th Street in Decatur Township. The victim was identified as 30-year-old Jose Cruz Armijo-Arreguin. Witnesses said that a man who had been drinking shot Jose inside a van. The 911 caller was the driver. Juan Luis Solis Reyna was named a suspect days into the investigation, but he ran from the police. The car he was driving was found dumped along I-55 in Missouri a few days later. The detectives tried their best to find Solis Reyna, but unfortunately, the case went cold. A breakthrough would only come almost 24 years later. Investigators reopened the cold case in February 2019, and finally, after 27 years, in May 2022, Solis Reyna was arrested after Van Buren County authorities teamed up with the FBI and located him in Monterrey, Mexico, where he lived with his family. They used technology to track him, and 5 months later he was extradited. Solis Reyna's attorney, Richard Catalino, spoke on his behalf in court. "Mr. Solis Reyna told me he recognizes that nothing he says, and nothing he can do, can bring back the life of Mr. Armijo. He regrets the demise of his friend. He regrets and feels deeply remorseful for the consequences it has had on Mr. Armijo's family for all these years." On July 28, 2023, after about 2 hours of deliberation, a jury found him guilty of second-degree slaying and felony firearm. Both men knew each other and were seasonal migrant workers in Van Buren County. Jose had 4 children, including 3 daughters. His one daughter, Lisbeth, 3 years old at the time of her father's slaying, said that the family members had no clue what led to the slaying. A statement from his oldest daughter, Sandra, read to the court, said, "My father's demise was the worst thing that could have happened to us. It left my mother to take care of 4 children at the time all by herself. We came to this country for a better life with her parents, and shortly after, he took our father from us. For many years, we lived in fear and with many unanswered questions. Why did he do it? Why did he take our father's life?" In a statement read by a victim advocate, his wife Amada said she struggled to raise their children alone after his end. "I have struggled emotionally and mentally as my soulmate was ripped away before his time." Ana, Jose's youngest daughter, told the court, "I would hear stories of my family in Mexico, spotting Solis, Reina living his life to the fullest, and always wondering why no one was doing anything about it." On September 18th, 2023, Solis Reina was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison and an additional 2 years for felony firearms. A man's body was found in his home in North Carolina in 1994. The case will turn cold for almost 3 decades, until the perpetrator was identified as someone close to home. On May 7th, 1994, Edward Ware's body was found at his home on the 200 block of Harris Street in Reidsville, North Carolina. Investigators reported signs of a violent struggle, evidence of robbery, and no forced entry. Despite an extensive investigation by the Reidsville Police Department and the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, the case grew cold as leads dwindled. On February 23rd, 2023, the Reidsville police re-looked at the case and its evidence. They then announced a break in this cold case with the help of new evidence technology. Reidsville Chief of Police Ray Gibson said that they are always investigating cases, but that this one had a breakthrough. The state crime lab retested the evidence to help the officers identify the suspect. Using a new program called STRmix, the investigators tested evidence dating back to the slaying. DNA evidence then led to Johnny Ware being charged with the first-degree slaying of Edward Ware. Johnny was Edward's nephew. Johnny was already in prison in Georgia for another unrelated slaying. While in prison, he was served the warrants for ending his uncle's life. He remained in a Georgia prison. When the investigators were asked how Edward's life was taken and what the motive was, the answer was that there was a lot of information that they cannot disclose about the case. The family of Edward was notified of the charge. Chief Gibson said, "They were extremely appreciative and glad that they can have some closure." He added, "They actually stated they wish that, the mother could have been here. The aunts and uncles, people that have passed on to know that justice is going to be served." Gibson said that multiple investigators worked on this case over the years. He said that this case shows them and others that this is why you do not give up on cold cases. Kevin Jones, a FBI assistant special agent in charge of the Northern Piedmont District, said, "I want to get families out there looking for hope and seeking justice for their loved ones to know that the victims are not forgotten. We will use all our resources and our new technologies to find and follow the evidence wherever it leads. And our objective is to find the truth." On November 22nd, 2024, Johnny Ware was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Monterey, California police never expected the interesting case that would land on their desk in 2014. One woman's body discovered would lead to another body found in a box under the kitchen table. And also, if that was not enough, a new identity was also involved. In February 2014, the Monterey Police Department responded to the demise of a woman in the 1100 block of 4th Street in Monterey, California. The woman, identified by her California driver's license as Francesca Linda Jacobs, with a birth date in 1955, had lost her life from starvation. No foul play was suspected. As part of the investigation, MPD officers and the Monterey County Sheriff Coroner located the decomposed remains of another person inside a box under the kitchen table. Francesca Jacobs had left a handwritten will naming the woman in the box as her mother, Ida Florence Jacobs. The remains were transported for an autopsy, where the body of a fully clothed woman was found inside of the box. Due to the condition of the remains in the box, which appeared to have been in that state for many years, no cause of demise could be determined. Foul play could not be ruled out. At the time of her demise, the woman identified initially as Francesca Jacobs appeared much older than the indicated age of 58 years, and her driver's license photo suggested similarly that the woman was older. The records for Francesca Jacobs were only related to her time living on the Monterey Peninsula, starting in the 1990s. Almost no records could be found for her mother. The investigation soon became known as the Mom in the Box case. The case unfortunately turned cold, as the investigators tried all possible avenues to solve this case. In late 2022, with the election of Monterey County Sheriff Coroner Tina Nieto, the Monterey County District Attorney's Office Cold Case Task Force began working directly with the Monterey County Sheriff Coroner's Office in an attempt to identify all unknown human remains cases in Monterey County. This included the Monterey case that was referred to as the Mom in the Box case, and Francesca Jacobs, whose true identities could not be established. 8 years later, in 2022, the Monterey County District Attorney's Office, in collaboration with the Monterey County Sheriff Coroner's Office and the California Department of Justice, submitted forensic evidence to Othram in hopes that advanced DNA testing could help identify both women. Othram scientists developed DNA extracts from the forensic evidence and used forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop comprehensive DNA profiles for the unknown women. Funding for Othram's DNA testing and forensic genetic genealogy research in this case was provided through the Roads to Justice funding program. Othram's in-house genealogy team used the profiles in a forensic genetic genealogy search and returned investigative leads to law enforcement for a follow-up investigation. The follow-up investigation led investigators to family members of the decedents, including a former husband of the woman who claimed to be Francesca Jacobs. In August 2023, the investigators were able to determine that the woman who had portrayed herself as Francesca Jacobs, who was born in 1955, was actually Linda Rae Jacobs, who was born in 1942. The California Department of Justice was able to confirm through confirmation DNA testing that Linda Rae Jacobs and Ida Florence Jacobs were indeed daughter and mother. As part of their investigation, the detectives learned that Linda Rae and Ida shared an unusually strong, lifelong bond. The reasons why Linda Rae Jacobs assumed a new name, or why she kept her mother's remains in a box under the kitchen table, are unknown and may never be known. In 1983, a teenager went missing in Red Bluff, California. Her body would be found on the same day, but after a false confession and rumors, advanced DNA technology would bring the breakthrough to identify the perpetrator. On March 3, 1983, 14-year-old Rachell Lee Ward was abducted while walking to school in Red Bluff. Later in the morning after Rachell went missing, sheriff's detectives were called to the area of Pine Creek Road, west of Red Bluff, where they found the body of a young female who had been bound, assaulted, and shot. The body was then identified as Rachell Ward. During the initial phases of the investigation, the sheriff's office sifted through numerous potential suspects, suspect vehicles, and took an overwhelming number of tips. The detectives also interviewed many others and vetted them for possible involvement. At one point, Henry Lee Lucas, known as the confession perpetrator, claimed responsibility for Rachell's end, but the detectives eliminated him due to inconsistencies in his confession. There were other rumors around town, including one was that the sheriff at the time, Ron Koenig, was involved, but no evidence supported the rumors. The detectives continued to interview witnesses leads were pursued and DNA samples were taken. As DNA technology advanced, officials resubmitted evidence for DNA analysis, but to no avail. Over the years, the case took several twists and turns, but work on the case continued, even as new detectives became involved. Almost 4 decades later, in 2022, the detectives discussed a new investigative approach involving the development of leads from family trees constructed using investigative genealogy. Detectives learned that a rootless strand of hair recovered from the victim, but that did not belong to her, could be tested to obtain a possible lead through this new ancestral DNA analysis. The sheriff's office also got assistance from the FBI and the California Department of Justice to develop leads using the new genealogy approach. The sheriff's office then contracted with Estrella Forensics and submitted the hair strand collected earlier. The results gave investigators a possible new suspect, Johnny Lee Coy, a former Red Bluff resident who had been convicted of kidnapping and assaulting a 21-year-old woman in Tehama County in 1989. The Tehama Sheriff's Office said in a news release, "This would not have been possible if not for all the hardworking, dedicated detectives throughout the years that spent countless hours trying to get justice for Rachell Ward." Coy was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, where he passed away in 2019. The DNA collected up to that point was not specific to Coy, though. The detectives needed help from Coy's family to narrow down the DNA match. Officials said, detectives located several family members and explained the situation. The family members agreed to assist and voluntarily provided a DNA sample to be compared against the DNA recovered from evidence located in 1983 by the California Department of Justice lab. Testing of family members came back with the same conclusion, that the DNA recovered in 1983 was a close relative to the family. A DNA sample taken from Coy when he was in prison originally did not have the same markers, but officials had the sample retested. In October 2023, the sheriff's office was notified that the DNA from the hair strand matched Coy's. Officials with the Tehama County District Attorney's Office concluded that if Coy was still alive, there would be enough evidence to charge him with the assault and slaying of Rachell. Officials said, the Tehama County Sheriff's Office is pleased to offer the family of Rachell Ward closure in this case after all these years. We are also pleased to be able to clear the name of former Sheriff Koenig of any criminal involvement in this case. Rachell's sister, Andrea Gum, expressed how she felt knowing Coy was not alive to answer for his crimes. She said, "You cannot yell or scream at him or tell him what he took away from you, and that is really hard." She also explained that although it is nice to have closure, it does not bring her sister back. It is not going to bring her back. It is not going to change anything. I guess in a sense, knowing that he has passed away, the person that actually took her life, that is a relief. Yvonne Le Roux's lifeless body was found in 1972 in Canada, but DNA found on the scene would only be tested more than 5 decades later. 16-year-old Yvonne Le Roux was last seen on the night of November 29, 1972, walking in the area of Oakdale Road and Finch Avenue West in Toronto, Canada. The next morning, her body was found on a side road in the township of King, 24 kilometers north. She had lost her life due to blunt force trauma to the head. Dozens of investigators worked on the case over the years, and the York Regional Police Services Board had twice issued a $50,000 reward linked to the case, but to no avail. The case went cold. For years, no one knew who ended her life until November 2023. Using suspect DNA found at the crime scene, which thankfully was secured at the time and preserved for more than 50 years, a DNA profile was generated and then uploaded to public genealogical databases. Armed with that new information, alongside a review of public and archival records, as well as evidence gathered at the time Yvonne's body was found, investigators narrowed their search down to the perpetrator's relatives, and then, finally, to the perpetrator himself. The police announced that the investigative tool investigative genetic genealogy, coupled with preserved DNA evidence from the scene, had pointed detectives to a Toronto man named Bruce Charles Cantillon. Cantillon took his own life in 1974, 19 months after Yvonne's demise. The 26-year-old was known to the police at the time, having committed several violent offenses against women and having been incarcerated at various points in his life due to mental health issues. The officers said that if Cantillon was still alive, he would have been charged with slaying. Deputy Chief Alvaro Almeida called the incident cruel and ruthless. Chief Almeida said, "Despite the sad circumstances of Yvonne's demise, I am gratified to be able to deliver her family this resolution, if not closure. I cannot imagine how difficult it must have been, living all these years with such a loss and not knowing, all this time, who is responsible." Detective Jonathan Nauman told the reporters that Cantillon's relatives were cooperative with the police, though investigators stressed the immense toll Yvonne's end has taken on her family. Nauman said it has been hard for Cantillon's family too. He said, "Learning 51 years later that someone they knew had done something so horrible, it is not easy for them either." The investigators say that they do not know of any connection between Yvonne and Cantillon, nor are they able to speculate on a motive in her demise. No weapon was ever found. In a statement read aloud at the news conference, Yvonne's family said that she is far from forgotten and noted how her end has affected them through many generations. The family said, "The case has remained a focus of attention in family gatherings and beyond, and has brought experiences we would not wish on anyone. Unfortunately, this news came late, as many of our family members have recently passed. For over half a century, our family has wondered. Getting some answers will never change what happened or bring her back." In 1973, Georgie Cannaday was found deceased in her Oklahoma home. The investigation would turn cold until a phone call would lead to a breakthrough 5 decades later. On June 28, 1973, 48-year-old Georgie Cannaday's body was found on the floor near the foot of her bed in her rural home in Jay, Oklahoma. Her body was rolled up in a braided rug. The top of her dress covered her head and face. The lower part of her dress was pushed up around her waist. Georgie's pet poodle was found alive, snuggled up to her body. She was an impeccable housekeeper, and nearly everything in her home appeared to be in order. Robbery was ruled out because her purse was found near her body and contained her personal papers and 18 $1 bills and some change. There were no signs of a struggle and no forced entry. The last time Georgie was seen by anyone was 2 days earlier, on June 26th, when she stopped by her neighbor's house to pick up her mail and visit. Named after her father, Georgie was one of 8 children. She beat the odds right as her life began, weighing just 2 pounds at birth. In 1925, there were no incubators for premature babies, so the family used a makeshift oven for those first few days of her life to keep her warm. Her niece, Wanda Forster, said, "She was simple, childlike, almost like a 10-year-old in an adult body." Georgie had some minor intellectual difficulties, and it was noted on her autopsy that she was disabled and on welfare. She lived alone in the house her father left her when he passed away in March 1973, just 3 months before Georgie was slain. She rarely left home, and most people considered the plainly dressed woman a recluse. In the final weeks of her life, she confided in neighbors, Johnny and Francis Bird, that she was worried about having to move and give up her home. She also confided in another neighbor, Elizabeth Landrum, that although she loved her family, she did not want to move to her sister's Spavinaw home, and she was afraid someone would burn her house down because a month earlier, a neighbor's house was destroyed by fire. For decades, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation classified Georgie's case as an open, inactive cold case. 48 years after the crime happened, in 2021, Delaware County Sheriff James Beck formed a cold case unit to look at several Delaware County cold cases, making good on a campaign promise. The oldest case, and perhaps the one thought to be the most unsolvable, was Georgie's case. In 1973, crime scene photos took days to develop. Reports were painstakingly typewritten, and if a mistake was made, the report had to be retyped. Also, DNA were just letters in the alphabet to these lawmen. Georgie's great-niece, Christina Asp, picked up the torch, searching for justice for a woman she had never met. Over time, Christina did get to know her great-aunt through family stories and photographs. She said, "I feel like I do know her from all the stories from my aunt and mother-in-law. Their faces would light up when they shared memories of her." In October 2021, after a night of poring over photographs, Christina picked up the telephone and reached out to the OSBI, inquiring about her great-aunt's 50-year-old case. She said, "Several of the aunts had made promises to Georgie's mother that they would continue looking for her perpetrator. Several of us family members are continuing what they started. What frustrated the family, as well as members of the cold case unit, was that the original crime scene photographs, reports, evidence, and other pertinent documents could not be found. After weeks of interviews, Detective Mark Wall and Sheriff Beck compiled an investigation file, 3 inches thick, filled with old interviews, new interviews, a crime scene summary, and yellowed newspaper articles. Due to forensic anthropologist Angela Berg's hard work, the 5-page autopsy report was found. Initially, Georgie's demise was ruled undetermined, but the report was amended to show she lost her life from strangulation. Both sides of her larynx and hyoid bone were extensively fractured. On July 3, 2023, Detective Wall received a telephone call from a woman whom read about Georgie's cold case and felt compelled to come forward with her father's 40-year-old secret. Detective Wall said, her parents had bought the old Cannaday home and became good friends with one neighbor who eventually passed away from cancer. The cancer-ridden neighbor confided to her parents that years earlier he had heard a confession from a man who lived near Georgie. The other man confessed to him that he ended Georgie's life with 2 other men. They had not planned on slaying Georgie, but things got out of hand and it went too far. This confession was confirmed by a woman who asked to remain anonymous. Kurt Titsworth, with the OSBI Cold Case Unit and Detective Wall, spent weeks following up and interviewing friends and family members of both suspects. What slowly emerged, Detective Wall said of Suspect 1, who was 76-year-old at the time, was a portrait of a strange man. He had quirky behaviors. For example, he was always suspicious of his neighbors, and he had a reputation of always carrying a gun and sneaking around back roads in rural Delaware County all night long. The second suspect was 16-year-old at the time. His history of strangling women pushed his name to the top of the list of suspects. Also, the fact that his family had a key to Georgie's home. OSBI agent Leo Albro wanted him to take a lie detector test in 1973. But Detective Wall said that he did not believe the teen ever submitted to a test due to him being a juvenile. Already known for having a dangerous reputation, the teen was notorious for telling people he was attracted to older women and not teenage girls his own age. The first suspect passed away in 1994, and the juvenile suspect lost his life in 2020. On August 7th, it was announced that this 50-year-old cold case is finally solved. Sheriff Beck said, "We believe 2 men took the life of Cannaday. Both were known to her, both had violent histories, and both lived close by." Detective Wall said, "Since one suspect was a juvenile and both suspects are deceased, we cannot release their names because we cannot prosecute them." Sheriff Beck added, "We have contacted the family and told them the case is officially closed. Not being able to officially release their names to the family is frustrating for the lawmen. The family has always wondered, what if she had moved in with a sister?" Christina said, "It is a very sad ending to a beautiful life. She was very loved, and all who knew her were devastated by how her life ended. May those men serve time for her demise in the afterlife." Remains were found in 1994 in Florida. The perpetrator confessed, but he did not know her name. The case went cold until she was identified almost 3 decades later. On September 15, 1994, the District 1 Medical Examiner's Office received the skeletonized remains of a female found near Interstate 10 in Florida. During the initial investigation, the remains were sent to the CA Pound Human Identification Laboratory in Gainesville by Dr. Keelman. An osteological examination showed the remains to be that of a white female aged approximately 35 to 55 years. Samples were sent for entomological examination for estimation of the time since her demise. In February 1996, Keith Jesperson, the serial perpetrator known nationally as the Happy Face perpetrator, admitted to an Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office investigator that he was responsible for ending the life of a Jane Doe in August 1994 and dumping her body near the Holt exit on Interstate 10. He told investigator Glenn Barbary that he believed the woman's name was Susan or Suzette. In 2007, a forensic artist completed a new facial reconstruction in hopes of identifying the victim, but it did not generate any leads. In 2008, the remains were sent for additional anthropological examination at the University of West Florida. Specimens were sent to the FBI laboratory for DNA analysis and entered into the National Missing Person DNA database. Despite the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and District 1 Medical Examiner's Office working decades to positively identify the woman, her name remained a mystery. That changed almost 3 decades later. Chrissy Knighton, chief investigator with the District 1 Medical Examiner's Office, said, "In 2023, the D1 MEO sent samples to Othram and, with funding through the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, a genealogical profile produced leads that led to Suzanne Kjellenberg's identification." In September, OCSO investigators Kelli Henderson and Aaron Pittman, along with Mark Zagar from the FDLE and Assistant State Attorney Michelle Sandler, traveled to the Oregon State Penitentiary, where Jesperson is currently serving 7 life sentences for the slayings of 7 other women across the country while he worked as a long-haul trucker. Jesperson, who was unaware until that morning of the group's arrival, met with them unannounced and provided additional details, which law enforcement was not previously aware of. Sheriff Eric Aiden said, "As of today's date, Jesperson has been charged with the slaying of Suzanne Kjellenberg." Suzanne, who was 34 at the time of her end, currently has family in Wisconsin. Notification has been made to her next of kin, who expressed gratitude for the perseverance of investigators, the Medical Examiner's Office, and the FDLE. They also asked for privacy to cope with this new development. At the Oregon State Penitentiary, Jesperson outlined again to investigators that he met the victim at a truck stop near Tampa in August 1994, and they traveled to a rest area in the Panhandle. While at the rest area, Jesperson was parked next to a security guard, and the victim was sleeping in his bed. When he sat next to her, he says she began screaming and would not stop. Jesperson told the investigators that he was not allowed to have unauthorized riders in his truck. He did not want to draw the security guard's attention, so he stopped her from breathing by pushing his fist against her neck. He later placed zip ties around her throat as well. Jesperson left the area and drove to the Holt exit on Interstate 10, where he disposed of her body. It was found by an inmate work crew in the tree row on September 14, 1994. Jesperson is known as the Happy Face perpetrator due to letters he wrote to the media detailing his crimes signed with a smiley face. Sheriff Aiden said, "Thanks to the tireless efforts of so many over so long, the remains of Suzanne Kjellenberg, the final unidentified victim of Jesperson's cross-country slaying sprees, can finally leave the medical examiner's office and return home." Two sisters were found deceased in 1942 in New Zealand. The initial detective's son would solve the case 40 years later after reading about the perpetrator in a book. On August 21st, 1942, Annie and Rosamond Smyth were found deceased by a neighbor in their Salvation Army home in Wairoa, New Zealand. Both were found lifeless from multiple head injuries inflicted with an axe and, in the case of Rosamond, who lost her life in the bedroom, with an iron fire poker. The police believed that they were slain 13 days earlier on August 8th. 62-year-old Brigadier Annie Smyth and her sister, 74-year-old Rosamond, had their home in the town's Salvation Army Hall. Annie, an ardent evangelist, had spent much of her adult life as a missionary in Japan, and she had an affection for the country and its people. That and her domineering manner made enemies of some when New Zealand was at war with Japan. At the sisters' Wellington funeral, the Salvation Army Commissioner J. Evans Smith said it appeared that a vindictive person had resented Annie's denunciation of sin. She was well known for attacking evil and could even be considered a Christian martyr, while Rosamond was kind, unassuming, and gracious. During the investigation, it was revealed that 2 visitors had been at the house, both on August 9th. One was a woman who passed through the Smiths' kitchen, not noticing the body of Annie lying in a damaged Morris chair. The visitor went into the hall to pray. The other visitor was an 8-year-old girl who had been playing with other children nearby. She entered the house, saw Annie, and carried on playing, throwing pillows out a window to children who threw them back. She told neither playmates nor her parents of the grisly find, because she was too frightened. Both women's clothing was disordered in a way that suggested a sexual motive, but there was no evidence of assault. Nor did robbery appear to be the motive, as money was found in both sisters' possessions. The slayings were investigated by Detective Bruce Young, but he was unable to bring anyone to book and went to his grave in 1952 with the case unsolved. 30 years later, in 1982, Bruce's son, Sherwood Young, was reading a book by former lawyer George Israel Joseph, By Person or Persons Unknown, which mentioned a client of his, whom Joseph called X. This man, when passing of cancer, had asked to see Joseph and told him that he ended the lives of the Smiths. Sherwood Young, who had followed his grandfather's calling into the New Zealand police and, at that time, held the rank of inspector, contacted Joseph for more information. He told the lawyer that he was Bruce Young's grandson, and the Smith slayings were his grandfather's cases that had never been solved. Joseph then said that 20 years earlier, in 1962, Leo Sylvester Hannon confessed to ending the lives of Annie and Rosamond, as well as that of Herbert William Brunton. Hannon was sentenced to life in prison 12 years earlier, in 1950, for taking the life of Frederick Andrew Stade. In October 1962, Hannon lost his life after he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. With this knowledge, Sherwood was able to posthumously solve his grandfather Bruce's cases. He was also able to confirm that Hannon was a serial perpetrator. Alameda, California police have solved a crime 45 years after it happened, thanks to new technology. On March 16, 1977, Richard Bischel was awakened by his 17-year-old son at 2:30 a.m. Richard Jr. worriedly told his father that he thought he heard a noise on the front porch of their home in Alameda, California. He was right. Outside, the pair saw a burglar casing the house. Richard and his son chased the burglar down the street. Richard Sr. was well ahead of his son. When his son caught up, he found his father stabbed 10 times on a sidewalk on Lincoln Avenue, and the suspect gone. 43-year-old Richard, a U.S. Marine who fought in the Korean War, was transported to a local hospital where he succumbed to his injuries. Richard Jr. had the following to say about his father. Dad was a good man. He would bend over backwards to help people out, even strangers. There was a possible suspect identified in the case, but due to limitation in DNA technology, charges could not be filed and the case went cold. 44 years after the crime happened, in 2021, the police department's cold case unit resubmitted a key piece of DNA evidence, a jacket that the suspect was wearing the night of the attack. A sample of blood from that jacket was sent to the Serological Research Institute in Richmond, which confirmed the blood belonged to the victim. The following year, in 2022, the case was finally cracked and the perpetrator was identified as Richard Curley Bernard, who was 23 years old at the time of the crime. On March 22, 2022, retired Alameda Police Department Detective Lorenzo Graham said during a news conference, he had been arrested and convicted for a series of Alameda burglaries, along with 2 known assaults. The detectives said that they also found circumstantial evidence finally proving that Bernard, who was a suspect back in 1977, was in fact the perpetrator. Bernard, who spent much of his life in prison for dozens of burglary convictions, was later shot and slain in Texas in 1989. Alameda County Deputy District Attorney Mark Melton said, "The suspect is deceased, but the family of the victim now knows the identity of the perpetrator and that law enforcement never stopped looking for him." Richard Jr. said, "I am happy that we have got a final resolution to this. It has been on my mind for the last 45 plus years. It has been a long, hard road, but I am glad we have a final resolution to this. On behalf of my family, my late mother, my 2 younger brothers, I would like to just say thank you to everyone. I do not know if there is any real closure. It does not change a whole lot, but we are glad that we do have a final positive ID." A young girl would lose her life, only for the detectives to learn that the perpetrator was very close to her. In March 2015, 18-year-old Anjelica A.J. Hadsell was supposed to be enjoying a relaxing spring break at home from her first year at college, but it turned into a tragedy when she went missing. A.J. was going through a breakup at the time she returned home to Norfolk, Virginia for spring break. This led her mother, Jennifer Wright, to believe that her daughter was blowing off steam when she went missing, after sending a text that said she was out with friends. However, after AJ did not return home and her ex-boyfriend, Corey French, found a piece of her credit card in the road, the investigators began to search more urgently for the missing teenager. The investigators initially suspected Corey, who AJ's stepfather, Wesley Paul Hadsell, had claimed had become obsessive over his stepdaughter. Wesley adopted AJ because AJ was getting her permit and she never used her biological dad's last name. Wesley, who had a criminal history, including convictions for bank robbery, breaking and entering, and burglary, was proactive in the search for his missing stepdaughter. During the search, he was arrested for breaking into the home of a person, claiming he was suspicious that person had kidnapped AJ. He said the following after his arrest for breaking and entering: "I would do anything for my daughter, my wife, my kids, and they make it sound like I would do anything to keep myself out of trouble. I could not sit a minute away from where my daughter may have been." However, the investigation began to center around him. Wesley's co-workers told the police that he was visibly agitated and had to take the rest of the day off work, on the day his stepdaughter went missing. The investigators searched Wesley's Chevy Astro van and discovered a shovel, duct tape, and work gloves in the back of the car. They also had a look at Wesley's GPS system on his car, and that led them to an abandoned house 60 miles away from the family's home. On April 9th, AJ's body was then discovered hidden in a ditch behind the abandoned house. The autopsy discovered that she had been poisoned intentionally with a heroin overdose. AJ was a softball player at Longwood University with a bright future. Norfolk Police Detective David Benjamin said, "She was an athlete. She was very outgoing. No issues with illegal substances or alcohol. Really was kind of flying straight." After more than 3 years, on November 19, 2018, 40-year-old Wesley was charged with slaying after he kidnapped and poisoned AJ. This happened after an investigation into his involvement eventually led a judge to say there was overwhelming evidence against him. The police investigating the case said that he kidnapped AJ while she was folding laundry and listening to music in the living room. The prosecutors said that he then tried to distract the police by lying and planting evidence in various places, including one of her jackets, at a friend's home. Wesley admitted to breaking into the home, but denied hiding the jacket there. In 2020, his first trial was declared a mistrial after 2 days over disagreements on what evidence the jury should be allowed to hear. On January 28, 2022, in court, the first person to take the stand was Jennifer, AJ's mom. She said that she and Wesley met in 2010 and ended up getting married a month after they met. They have one child together who is 10 years old. Jennifer said that in 2015, she kicked Wesley out of the house because she found out he started using illegal substances. He then decided to stay at a hotel close to their home. Jennifer said that she even tried holding an intervention with Wesley, his mother, and his nephew. On March 2, 2015, she picked AJ up from college. AJ was a freshman, double majoring in information technology and computer programming. Jennifer said that on the day AJ disappeared, Wesley called her at work to drop his personal truck off and pick up his work truck. She said that she told him to leave the keys in the mailbox just in case AJ needed to go somewhere. When Jennifer arrived home, she testified that AJ was gone. However, her wallet and coat were still in the home. The family also noticed some clothes of AJ's were missing, and a note was left on the kitchen table. The note read, "With everything going on, it is a lot to deal with." Jennifer said that she questioned the note because it did not make sense to her or her other daughters. During the search for AJ, Wesley often received tips and would go investigate them. Jennifer said that every time she found something out, she would let an investigator know what they found. Jennifer said that Wesley tried to blame Corey, AJ's ex-boyfriend, for her disappearance. Jennifer confirmed that Wesley and AJ were close and confirmed that she does not believe he ever assaulted, touched, or made inappropriate comments toward her. She said that she did feel uncomfortable when she found out that he was doing illegal substances. The man who said that he sold illegal substances to Wesley also testified and said that he had been selling Wesley cocaine and heroin for years. A tense moment arose when Zach Hoffer, AJ's stepfather before Wesley, was prepared to make a testimony before the judge's sentencing. Wesley's attorney, James Ellenson, objected, in which the judge sustained the motion, after which Zach had to be forcibly removed by authorities from the courtroom after yelling expletives toward Wesley. On April 4th, 2022, Wesley Hadsell was sentenced to life in prison plus 15 years for ending AJ's life. The extra years is 5 years for concealing the body and 10 years for being caught with illegal substances while incriminated. Wesley continues to maintain his innocence. He again denied his involvement during a jailhouse interview by saying, "I swear to you, I did not hurt my daughter. I do not know who did. And if I did, I would not protect them." A house fire would end the life of a husband and father of 5. DNA technology would lead to the discovery of what truly happened on that day. On May 22, 2018, a fire was reported to Cannon City Fire at the home on the 1800 block of Pinion Avenue in Fremont County, Colorado. The firefighters then discovered the body of 76-year-old Kenneth Orchard in the charred interior of his own home at the bottom of a stairwell near the front door. His wife, Lorene Orchard, was leaving her warm water therapy class when she got a call from a neighbor telling her that the fire department was at her house. According to an autopsy, Kenneth's cause of demise was strangulation and blunt force injuries. He had hemorrhages throughout his body and his eyes, on the inside of his lips, on the inside of his cheeks. His skull and his neck was fractured. Many witnesses came forward and told the investigators that they saw an unidentified male walking away from the Orchard residence on the morning of the fire. One witness told the investigators that she saw a male walking across Spring Creek Park around 200 yards from the fire. She told the investigators that he was in such a hurry and got into a white pickup truck and drove off. It was soon discovered that the white pickup truck was owned by Fremont Paving and Ready Mix. In April 2019, a former Fremont County Sheriff's deputy, Christopher Pape, was sentenced to 2 years in prison after pleading guilty to stealing silver ingots, nearly $6,000 in coins and other valuables from Kenneth's home while helping to investigate the case. The investigation was declared a fatal arson and a slaying, but it would take 2 years before a person would be charged in this case. DNA was found on an empty gas can on the house's front porch. In 2020, when tested, it matched to Matthew Rogers. The investigators also found items stolen from the Orchard home at Rogers' parents' home, as well as burnt items of clothing. He also worked at Fremont Paving and Ready Mix in 2018. Rogers was dealt a slew of charges, including first-degree arson, first-degree burglary, and slaying in the first degree. Court documents painted a clearer picture as to what happened to Kenneth the morning of May 22nd. According to the Fremont County Sheriff Alan Cooper, this was a burglary gone horribly wrong. Rogers intended to burglarize the home of Kenneth. Kenneth had returned to his home after having worked his shift at Big Burger World and then stopped by the Family History Center at his church. The investigators believed that Kenneth was returning to his home in the middle of the burglary, and Rogers attacked. 2 fires were then set inside the house, one in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, and another right in front of the front door of the residence. Rogers was being held at the Fremont County Detention Center without bond. The investigators did not have to look far in order to make an arrest. He was already being held at the detention center for separate unrelated domestic violence charges. On April 5, 2022, 47-year-old Matthew Rogers was found guilty of all charges. At the sentencing on May 23rd, before both the prosecution and defense made their final statements, members of Kenneth's family made impassioned and heartbreaking statements to senior Judge Plotz. All 5 of his children recounted the horrors they have each had to live through after the atrocious slaying of their father. Lanai, Kenneth's eldest daughter, said, "I am done giving time to the man who ended the life of my dad. He took time and memories that did not belong to him. I am not giving him any more, with the exception of this hour." Kenneth's son and second child, Lynn, also had thoughts to share with the judge and those gathered. He recounted how, alongside his newly widowed mother, he entered Walmart the day after the crime, in an attempt to gather her new belongings as her home was destroyed. He said, "Everything in the world my mother had was ripped from her. We stood in the clothing section of Walmart with an empty shopping cart, in shock, literally paralyzed by the magnitude of the task. How do you start there? What do you put into a shopping cart to rebuild a life?" Amy, the third child, said, "My whole world turned black. My face was black. My pants were black. My clothes were black. All my childhood memories were black. The windows were so black. And most of all, my heart was black." On May 22nd, 2018, Matthew Rogers gave me and my family a life sentence. A life sentence of trying to bring back color when we were given so much black. Lureen, Kenneth's wife of over 40 years, made her statement last. She said, "He was my best friend, husband, and companion. Where was my comfort and confidence? I needed Ken to help me cope with losing Ken." Rogers was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. A perpetrator would hear his fate 33 years after the crime took place. In May 1990, 20-year-old Susan Negersmith from Carmel, New York in Putnam County was at the Jersey Shore in New Jersey with friends for Memorial Day weekend. She then went missing. The authorities found her body on May 27th behind a restaurant. Her demise had first been classified as accidental, but was later ruled a slaying. It was after a medical examiner, who later studied autopsy photos, listed 26 points of trauma on the victim's body. She had also been assaulted. Neither evidence from the scene, which included scrapings from under her fingernails, nor police investigations led to anyone being charged in her assault or demise, and the case went cold. 28 years later, in 2018, lab testing identified a person of interest. But then, the authorities had to do the difficult job of finding a way to obtain his DNA. In June 2021, 3 years later, the DNA matched to Jerry Rosado. The Cape May County Prosecutor's Office then charged him in April 2022, when he was 62 years old, with assaulting Susan. He was not charged with her demise. In 2023, a state appeals court decision led to the dismissal of the charge due to the statute of limitations, and the state's highest court decided not to disturb that decision. At the trial level, Rosado's lawyers argued the statute of limitations at the time of the crime, in 1990, was 5 years, and the clock had run out. The trial judge, though, denied the argument, saying the clock did not start until 2021, when the investigators made a DNA match, citing a 2002 change to the assault statute. Rosado's lawyers went to the appellate level, where a panel of judges reversed the trial judge, finding the statute of limitations was 5 years in 1990. The appeals decision explained how 2 changes to the assault law since then did not impact this case. First, in 1996, the statute of limitations for assault was removed, starting for cases that had not yet run out, as of May 1st, 1996. In Susan's case, the statute of limitation for assault ended May 27, 1995. And in 2002, an amendment to the assault law provided for a time exception for cases involving DNA or fingerprint evidence. But the amendment provided for no retroactivity, nor does other case state and federal case law. The state Supreme Court quoted the 2023 appeals decision, which found the 2002 amendment could not reach back and constitutionally revive a statute of limitation that had already expired. The decision effectively ends the case against Jerry Rosado. Emily Negersmith, Susan's sister, said, "She was just a young girl, 20 years, down with her friends. She did not deserve this. No one deserves that." Dawn Negersmith, Susan's other sister, said, "You know we just want it solved, so we can have closure on this case." The Salt Lake City, Utah Police Department could finally announce the closure of a cold case from 48 years ago. On February 28, 1974, 39-year-old James Bednarik was shot and lost his life at his own home in Salt Lake City, Utah. As part of the investigation, the investigators developed a profile about James. Through their research, the investigators discovered that he was selling stolen gasoline. The police discovered that a year prior to his end, James had gotten into a dispute with an owner of a gas station over stolen gas. James then shot and injured the owner as a result of the argument. In the investigation of who ended James's life, all available leads were explored by the detectives. However, the police were unable to identify the suspect, and the case went cold. 44 years later, in 2018, the squad from the Salt Lake City Police Department used new forensic technology to test the evidence. However, no new leads were generated as a result of the test. In 2022, 4 years later, 2 retired police detectives, while having lunch, discussed the case. Eventually, the 2 detectives learned that George B. Toone had confessed to ending the lives of 2 men in Salt Lake County, including James Bednarik, at the request of the gas station owner. The detectives then requested the Salt Lake City Police Department Crime Lab to perform a forensic test on 2 latent fingerprints collected at the crime scene in 1974. Then, those fingerprints came back to Toone. SLCPD Chief Mike Brown said in a press release, "In recent years, DNA and other technology has greatly aided in solving cold cases along with new cases. This is a great example of the continued dedication, professionalism, and care both active and retired officers have in these cases. I am proud of our detectives. They never let up in their pursuit of justice. Based on the evidence they have in the case, Salt Lake City Police said that the detectives are confident that Toone was responsible for the end of James. Toone was hiding as he waited for James to return home in the 500 block of East 1st Avenue, and then executed him. Toone lost his life on September 11, 2011, at 75 years old, due to natural causes. In 2015, another case was linked to Toone. On October 28, 1976, 47-year-old rancher William Ercon Breck was shot in the back of the head with a high-powered rifle as he was opening the gate to his ranch in Clarks Canyon, Utah. If he were still alive, they would have had enough evidence to charge Toone. Blaine Erkenbrack and Bill Erkenbrack, Williams' family, said in a statement at the time, "We may now be able to find some source of closure in this matter and can move forward, knowing that there are certain law enforcement professionals out there that really do care about carrying out their duties to protect and to serve." The modus operandi in each slaying was startlingly similar. James's family has been notified of the status in the case. The police are still continuing to investigate the reports that Toone ended a second person's life in Salt Lake County. A drive-by shooting would lead to a confession and the arrest of 3 people. On November 9, 2018, 23-year-old Tavonte White and 21-year-old Alicia Justice were found deceased in a crashed black Honda Accord that hit a cement wall of the Natchez Stew Pot in Mississippi. When the Natchez police arrived on the scene, they discovered that the vehicle had been shot at several times. The police obtained surveillance footage from multiple cameras located near the scene and identified the vehicle from which the bullets were fired as a silver and gray 2008 Chevrolet Cobalt. Tavonte was under grand jury indictment for armed robbery and possession of a weapon by a convicted felon. He had been shot before, and no arrests were made in those shootings because Tavonte did not cooperate with the investigators. The case would only be solved more than 2 years later when the police arrested 18-year-old Jameco Davis and 23-year-old Kendarius Davis and Jaclorence Jackson. The fourth person, Macaleus Johnson, is deceased. In February 2021, Kendarius Davis was in the Adams County Jail, undergoing questioning about a separate incident. During an interview with the investigators, he confessed to having information about the slaying of Tavonte and Alicia. Warrants were issued for Jackson and Jameco Davis. Jackson denied any involvement in the crime and claimed to be with his girlfriend on the night of the crime. Jameco Davis also denied any involvement in the crime and claimed to have been in Texas during the time of the crime. However, when the investigators showed Jameco Davis an Instagram video made on the day of the shooting, showing him and Kendarius Davis together and bragging about the crime, he admitted it was him in the video, but denied any involvement in the shooting. On October 10, 2021, Kendarius Davis recanted his original statement implicating Jameco Davis and Jackson. Instead, he offered up the names of 3 others as being responsible. On March 7, 2022, Kendarius Davis recanted his recantation, claiming he did so because he feared for his life. They knew Tavonte White and started shooting when they saw him driving past them. On June 24, 2022, Jackson and Jameco Davis were sentenced to 2 life sentences to run concurrent with each other, plus another 10 years for firearm enhancements. Kendarius Davis entered a plea to second-degree slaying. He has not been sentenced yet. On January 19, 2024, the firearm enhancement convictions were vacated for Jackson and Jameco Davis. However, it affirmed the life sentence given to each of them. They appealed their sentence, claiming that the firearms enhancement was illegal, that the trial court did not follow proper procedure, and that the verdict was against the overwhelming weight of the evidence. Further, Jackson claimed in his appeal that Judge Blackwell erred in not separating his trial from Davis's. The court agreed with the firearm enhancement portions of the sentences and vacated those, but found that all other issues were without merit. It took more than 2 decades to bring a person responsible for the demise of 4 women to justice. On April 3, 1997, Laura Smither, a 12-year-old aspiring ballerina, went for a morning jog near her home in Friendswood, Texas. She never returned. As days passed, Gay and Bob Smither searched for their daughter with the help of their community, thousands of volunteers, and even the U.S. Marines. Unfortunately, no one was able to find a trace of the missing girl. After 17 long days of searching for her, Laura's decomposed body was found 12 miles from her home on April 20th in a Pasadena, Texas retention pond by a father and son out walking their dogs. After weeks in the water, her cause of demise was unclear. Despite this devastating news, a suspect quickly emerged. The suspect was William Reese, who worked at a construction site just down the road from the Smithers Friendswood home. While Reese was on their radar and his truck was searched in connection to Laura's case, the police did not have enough evidence to make an arrest at the time, so he remained a free man. A month later, on May 16th, 19-year-old Sandra Sapaugh stopped at a convenience store near Interstate 45. She said that she noticed a man staring at her in the parking lot, and when she saw him again at the Waffle House restaurant across the street, he offered to help her with a newly discovered flat tire. Sandra was confused by this and said that before she knew what was happening, the stranger forced her into his white pickup truck and assaulted her. He sped away with her in his truck and got on the interstate. Sandra was fearing what might happen to her if she stayed, so she jumped from the fast-moving truck into the middle of the highway. The jump badly injured her, but it saved her life from what might have happened. The next month, on July 15th, Kelli Cox, a 20-year-old mother and student at the University of Northern Texas, was taking a tour of the Denton Police Department as a part of her criminal justice class, but she left early to take an exam. Shortly after leaving, Kelli discovered that she was locked out of her car and used a payphone at a nearby gas station to call her boyfriend for help. When he showed up, Kelli was nowhere to be found. Later that day, when Kelli failed to pick her toddler up from daycare, her mother, Jan Bynum, said that she knew something was terribly wrong. Kelli was a dedicated student, taking summer classes, and hoped to graduate early with a degree in social work. Although Kelli was a young mother to her daughter Alexis, she embraced it fully. Alexis was Kelli's whole world, and Kelli's mother, Jan, knew that Kelli would never leave Alexis behind. The days of searching turned into weeks, and despite her best efforts, Jan could not figure out exactly what happened to her daughter. With no body and no strong leads, the case began to grow cold. About a month later, on July 26th, Tiffany Johnston, a 19-year-old and newly married woman, vanished in broad daylight from a car wash in Bethany, Oklahoma. Her floor mats were still hanging on the drying racks and the keys were still in the ignition, but there was no sign of Tiffany, and no one at the car wash reported seeing anything out of the ordinary that day. Tiffany's mother, Kathy Dobry, was left mystified and wondered what happened to her youngest daughter. The next day, on July 27th, Tiffany's partially clothed body was found in tall grass next to an unpaved rural road close to the interstate. It was just 15 miles from the car wash where Tiffany was last seen alive. She had been strangled and assaulted. The investigators were able to recover the perpetrator's DNA from her body, but they could not develop a suspect profile from it at the time, and the case went cold. Just 3 weeks after Tiffany's slaying, on August 17th, 17-year-old Jessica Cain was last seen leaving a restaurant in Clear Lake, Texas, where she was out with friends. When Jessica missed curfew, her father, C.H. Cain, went out looking for her. After searching for hours, he found his daughter's truck abandoned on the shoulder of Interstate 45, just a couple of miles from their home. There was no trace of Jessica and no clues as to where she was. Search parties and friends looked for any sign of Jessica, but they had no luck. Gay and Bob Smither, who were still processing the loss of their own daughter Laura just 4 months earlier, joined the search immediately, saying that they felt called by God to help. After weeks of searching for answers, once again, the investigators were left without leads, and Jessica's case also grew cold. In October, 5 months after Sandra Sapaugh's abduction, during a meeting with Friendswood police, Webster investigators realized that Sandra's description of her kidnapper's vehicle sounded similar to the truck Friendswood police had searched in Laura Smithers' case, belonging to William Reese. On October 16, 1997, Reese was pulled in for a lineup and Sandra identified him as her attacker. Reese was released from prison in the fall of 1996 after serving nearly 10 years for assaulting 2 women in his native Oklahoma. After his release, Reese briefly stayed with his mother in Anadarko, Oklahoma, before moving to Harris County, Texas. There he worked as a farrier and a construction worker. Reese made frequent trips between his new home in Texas and his mother's home in Oklahoma in 1997. Reese was then arrested after being identified in the lineup and charged with kidnapping, to which he pleaded not guilty. When Reese was put on trial for the kidnapping of Sandra, his past came back to haunt him. The jury heard Sandra's powerful testimony, and his victims from the 80s also took the stand and shared how they were both brutally attacked by Reese in Oklahoma. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before they found Reese guilty. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. 15 years later, in 2012, retired police chief Lynn Williams had started working for the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations and was assigned to Tiffany Johnston's cold case. Williams went through the case file methodically and came to think that the crime scene DNA was their best bet at identifying Tiffany's perpetrator. The DNA from Tiffany's body had already been tested twice before with no results. But with advancements in DNA testing, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations supervising criminologist Wendy Duke and her team were able to develop a partial male profile. The team compared this partial profile to the profiles from known suspects and eliminated all other suspects until they got to Reese. In December of 2013, a buccal swab was collected from Reese and sent to the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations for comparison. With his DNA in hand, Wendy Duke was finally able to connect Reese to the DNA recovered from Tiffany's body, and Reese could not be eliminated as the contributor. On September 22, 2015, an arrest warrant was issued for William Reese by the state of Oklahoma for the slaying and kidnapping of Tiffany Johnston. Oklahoma law enforcement shared their new DNA discovery with Texas investigators, who wondered if they could get Reese to talk about a potential connection to the cases of Laura Smither, Kelly Cox, and Jessica Cain. The investigators from Texas went to visit Reese in prison, but before he agreed to speak further, he wanted the end-of-life sentence taken off the table. The Smithers agreed, and Jan Bynum agreed, just hoping to learn what happened to their daughters. Despite only having an agreement to waive the end-of-life sentence for Kelly Cox and Laura Smithers' cases, William Reese ended up confessing to all 4 women's slayings. On March 18, 2016, with the help of some information from Reese, after 25 days of digging, Jessica Cain's remains were discovered in a field on East Orem Drive, near Hobby Airport. Jessica's parents asked for privacy while they buried their daughter. 2 weeks after Jessica's remains were unearthed, on April 1st, Kelly Cox's were found in nearby Brazoria County. After so many years of wondering what happened to her daughter and Alexis's mother, Jan Bynum finally had answers. Kelly's bracelet was found with her remains, and Jan had it made into a locket. After Reese led investigators to Kelly Cox and Jessica Cain's remains, Oklahoma prosecutors wanted Reese transported to Oklahoma so he could face the charges for the slaying and kidnapping of Tiffany Johnston there. Tiffany's trial began on May 18, 2021. Even though prosecutors had DNA linking him to Tiffany and his confession, Reese entered a plea of not guilty. After 9 days, the jury deliberated and took less than 2 hours to find Reese guilty of ending the life of Tiffany Johnston. He was sentenced to the end-of-life penalty. After being found guilty in Tiffany's case, Reese returned to Texas on March 8, 2022, to face justice in the slaying of Laura Smither, Kelly Cox, and Jessica Cain. On June 29, 25 years after the slayings of Laura Smither, Kelly Cox, and Jessica Cain, their families finally got their day in court. William Reese pleaded guilty in Galveston and Brazoria counties and was given 3 life sentences, 1 for each life he took. A family of 4 were executed due to illegal substance trading gone wrong, and a wife and 2 sons had to suffer due to the bad decisions a husband and father made. On January 27, 2017, 37-year-old Crystal Lynn Careaga, 16-year-old Hunter Evan Schaap, and 16-year-old Jonathan Felipe Higgins were all fatally shot within their home in Kitsap County, Washington, before the residence was set ablaze. Exactly 2 days later, the charred corpse of 43-year-old Johnny Derek Careaga was uncovered in his light-duty truck off a remote road at a forest plantation in Mason County, Belfair, Washington, where he had been gunned down and torched. A property caretaker of this said farm told the investigators that Johnny had been on the land lot earlier that day without his truck. Johnny and Crystal had gotten married in 2009. The 2 teenage boys came from prior relationships the parents had been involved in. The Careagas were the owners of Crystal's Java Hut and Juanito's Taco Shop, a thriving Mexican restaurant in Bremerton, Washington. That faithful evening, Crystal had some friends over at their residence. Meanwhile, Johnny received a phone call while at the house and went out to meet someone, telling the family that he would return home shortly. Johnny later returned to the home, but he did not enter the house. One of the guests that was visiting at the Careaga residence went to the garage to check up on him, only to hear 3 men talking in loud voices. As the attack on the family took place, the police in Bremerton, Washington received a phone call from Hunter, who informed 911 emergency dispatchers that he and his family had been shot and begging them to hurry over to the house. The phone line subsequently cut off and Hunter was smothered with a pillow before being fatally shot in his head. When the responders later arrived at the Careaga home, they found the residential premises burning down in flames, with the bodies of Crystal, Hunter, and Jonathan all lifeless. According to the Kitsap County Fire Marshal's office, fire log that was likely soaked with some type of fire accelerant had been placed on the beds at opposite ends of the home after Crystal, Hunter, and Jonathan had all lost their lives. Large rocks were then thrown through the house windows to fuel the flames. When the investigators examined the crime scene, they uncovered over $50,000 in cash stowed within a strongbox, along with a money bag in the master bedroom containing $7,000. The quadruple slaying of the family of 4 is said to have been the result of a dispute between Johnny and the perpetrators over illicit illegal substance sales, as he was the apparent target of the attack. Apparently, Johnny would regularly bring back a kilogram of substances from California every few months to sell for profit in Kitsap County, Washington. Detectives from the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office, in conjunction with FBI special agents, have come to the conclusion that members and associates of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club had been involved in the slaying of the Careaga family. The Bandidos MC are a self-proclaimed one-percenter outlaw motorcycle club with a global presence who have had a long-standing history of involvement in organized crime, as well as other unlawful activities, including illegal substance trafficking and slaying. Some of the customers who bought substances from Johnny were members of the Bandidos MC. One of Johnny's close friends started selling the substances that he transported from California to Robert Bobby Watson III, a fully patched member of the Bandidos MC Bremerton chapter. It is unknown whether Bobby had purchased the substances for his own personal use or to resell and profit off of. The friend of Johnny's eventually decided to put a stop to the selling, placing Johnny into direct communication with Bobby as a subsequent result. When Johnny would end up taking his routine trip down to California after this incident, Bobby would follow closely behind him, ultimately causing an intense verbal argument between both men. Bobby has been described as the alleged mastermind behind the slayings. When asked by fellow club members about his involvement in the Careaga family slayings, Bobby would reply with different and inconsistent responses. The president of the Bandidos Bellingham chapter condemned the crime and cooperated with the law enforcement investigators, expressing his disapproval towards any club member who would take the lives of women and children. Bremerton resident Johnny J. Watson is the younger brother of Bobby Watson. Unlike his brother Bobby, however, Johnny Watson is not affiliated with the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. Danny J. Kelli Jr. was a hang-around associate of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club, whose prospective membership was sponsored by Bobby. He was seen in police surveillance footage wearing Bandidos MC supporter apparel. Daniel had once also had a close relationship with Johnny Careaga, even going so far as to serve as the best man at his first wedding. The two later had a fallout after Johnny accused Danny of stealing from him. The investigators assembled a task force to look into the quadruple slaying. Each of the three perpetrators, whose identities were not initially publicized, were booked into the Kitsap County Jail. The arrestees were incarcerated on 16 different felony charges per person, among those being aggravated slaying, arson, and burglary. Danny Kelli, Robert Watson, and Johnny Watson all pled not guilty to the felony charges. A judge ordered that the trio were to be held without bail and were not to possess firearms, alcohol, or illegal substances unless otherwise prescribed. Furthermore, the three assailants were forbidden to have any contact with one another. Finally, after 7 years, in April 2024, the men were found guilty of 30 charges, including first-degree slaying, premeditated slaying, and arson, and on May 7th, they were sentenced to life without parole. An arrest has finally been made in a hit-and-run cold case from 2012, where a young woman sadly lost her life. On February 11, 2012, 24-year-old Kimberly Encinia was walking along the side of McCardle Road near Nile in Texas. She was on her way to a friend's Valentine's Day sleepover at a nearby church when she was struck and lost her life by a hit-and-run driver just yards from her destination. The driver left her at the side of the road with severe injuries. She was transported to a hospital, but sadly did not make it. Kimberly was a student at Del Mar College, and she was involved in young adult ministry and volunteer work at the American Sign Language Deaf Center in Corpus Christi. Kimberly loved the ministry because she felt that she could make a change in their lives and had a strong pursuit to bring people to Christ. Kimberly's case went cold as detectives were unable to determine the driver responsible for the crash. But a decade later, on July 12, 2022, the police received a tip from the community that pointed them in the right direction and that led them to conduct additional interviews. The new information led to an arrest warrant against 45-year-old Michael Atkinson, who was already in the Nueces County Jail for indecent exposure and driving while intoxicated. He has been arrested for driving while intoxicated several times. He was served the arrest warrant for an accident-causing demise or bodily injury with a $250,000 bond. At the time of Kimberly's accident, the roadway did not include sidewalks. That eventually changed, as the city of Corpus Christi improved the area with 9 road projects that cost $62 million. Kimberly's mother, Mary Encinia, said she is still trying to process the news, but began to recount the night that her daughter lost her life. Kimberly had just left her mother's apartment at the Oso Bay Apartments. She was walking to the Nest Church. Mary said that she was never one to be curious about flashing lights, but said something called out to her to go see what was going on. Mary saw her daughter in a ditch just as the police began processing the crime scene. In May 2023, Atkinson pleaded guilty and accepted a plea deal for 10 years probation. After 42 years, a perpetrator responsible for the end of a 15-year-old girl and 3 other young women in Los Angeles and Inglewood, California, was arrested. On March 6, 1980, 25-year-old Beverly Cruz and 22-year-old Deborah Cruz, 2 sisters, were each shot in the head 3 times in an apartment in the 3200 block of Overland Avenue in Palms, Los Angeles. On July 26, 1980, 15-year-old Carrie Lenander was strangled in the 3700 block of Victoria Avenue, Los Angeles. And 15 years later, on December 31, 1995, 28-year-old Trina Wilson's throat had been slashed in North Park in Inglewood. According to the Los Angeles County DA, all 4 of the victims had been intimately assaulted. Despite the efforts of the detectives to investigate these cases, they were unable to identify the perpetrator. They stored all evidence, and then the case went cold. More than 26 years after the last crime took place, on July 14, 2022, the perpetrator was identified as 76-year-old Billy Ray Richardson. He was arrested in connection with all 4 the Southern California slayings of the women decades ago. The officers credit investigative, forensic work, and DNA evidence from the 1995 slaying with leading them to Richardson. Richardson's identification as the suspect in the slayings and his subsequent arrest was the result of a collaborative investigation involving the LAPD, Inglewood Police Department, FBI, Fort Worth Police Department, and investigators from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. Detectives from the Los Angeles and suburban Inglewood Police Departments, with the help of officers from the Fort Worth Police Department, took him into custody. Richardson was charged by the Los Angeles County prosecutors with 4 counts of first-degree slaying with the special circumstance of multiple slayings and slaying in the commission of assault. He was brought into the court on a hospital gurney after being extradited from Texas. Unfortunately, Richardson then passed away while in custody. The court had received documentation that Billy Ray Richardson was pronounced deceased on February 15, 2023. The case against him was dismissed as a result of his demise. Richardson lost his life from complications of a cervical spine injury and blunt force trauma, according to records from the coroner's office, which concluded that the manner of his demise was an accident. The coroner's office also listed COVID-19, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and dementia as other significant conditions for Richardson. Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman said outside the downtown Los Angeles courtroom, "I just feel very sad for the families that will never get to see him held responsible for the crimes he committed, the horrendous slayings of these 4 young women. I hope at the very least it brings them some peace to know we have identified the perpetrator, and he is no longer living among us." A woman was assaulted and so brutally attacked that it left her lifeless. Due to the lack of available technology at the time, the case went cold for 30 years before the perpetrator was finally identified and arrested. On September 22, 1991, 28-year-old Rita Davis's body was found near 7th Street and McKinney in Waco, Texas. Her pants and underwear were missing. At the time, an autopsy was conducted and showed that Rita lost her life due to blunt force trauma to her head and a hemorrhage to her neck. The medical examiner also found male DNA inside her body, which indicated that she was assaulted. The detectives interviewed her friends and neighbors and heard that Harold Givens and 2 friends were smoking crack cocaine one evening. And then Rita and Harold got into a fight. The other 2 friends left Rita and Harold, but when they returned that night, both of them were gone. The police conducted interviews with Harold and the 2 friends, but found that the friends gave conflicting information. One friend said that the fight happened on September 17th, while the other friend said the fight happened on September 21st, the night before she was found deceased. The police took a sample of Harold's blood and saliva, but technology available at the time could not help determine if he had something to do with her losing her life. The case then went cold. 15 years later, in 2006, a detective then retested the samples using advanced DNA technology and found minor samples of Harold's DNA. The police did not explain why an arrest was not made that year, or why the case went cold again for another 16 years. In 2022, however, Harold was re-interviewed after a cold case detective and a special crimes detective told him his original statement about what happened was not true, thanks to the DNA results. Initially, Harold told the detectives that he and Rita had intercourse, but according to the police, the tests showed otherwise. When re-interviewed, Harold told the detectives that he got angry with Rita because she wanted more substances, so he hit her with a closed fist a few times. The police did not clarify if Harold Givens assaulted her too, despite male DNA samples being found originally. On June 21, 2022, the 30-year-old cold case was finally solved after 65-year-old Givens was arrested at his home in Waco, without incident. He was then charged with slaying. He remained jailed at a $25,000 bond. The police said in a news release, "The Waco Police Department would like to acknowledge the previous work done by the assigned detectives in 1991, 1992, and 2006. Without their initial investigative work, an arrest would not have been able to be made today." Lucretia Franklin, Rita's daughter, recalls the night she was told that her mother would not return home at just 9 years old. She said, "I tell everybody the world stopped, never giving up on what she knew was true in her heart. Lucretia knew one day her family would get justice. I told my mama, I am going to fight for you until the breath is out of me.